A kind-hearted waitress paid for the coffee of an elderly man, unaware that he was a billionaire quietly searching for his future life partner. At Riverside Brew, a cozy cafe nestled in the heart of Langford's old quarter. The morning buzzed with quiet chatter and the soft patter of rain tapping against the large glass windows. Outside, the city blurred behind a curtain of rain, warm light casting gentle glows on the puddles below. The aroma of freshly roasted coffee mingled with the earthy scent of wet pavement, turning the cafe into a refuge for those seeking comfort on a damp, gray day. Amid the clinking of cups and murmured conversations, the wooden door creaked open, ushering in a gust of cold air. A man in his early 50s stepped inside. His thin, tattered coat clung to him, soaked through, and his scuffed shoes left faint watermarks on the polished floor. His graying hair, plastered to his forehead, and weary eyes spoke of years weathered by hardship. He walked slowly toward the counter, eyes scanning the menu before settling on the young man behind the register. His voice, low and gravelly as if afraid to disturb the peace, broke the quiet. "One black coffee, please." The barista, a sharp-jawed young man named Leo, gave a curt nod and began preparing the drink. Meanwhile, the older man fumbled through his pockets, hands trembling slightly. Panic flickered across his face. No wallet. He checked again and again, but it wasn't there. I'm sorry," he said, voice shaky with embarrassment. "I must be left my wallet at home. If it's all right, could I just sit here for a bit until the rain lets up?" Leo folded his arms and smirked, voice loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. "Listen, old man," he said, "this is a coffee shop, not a shelter. Nothing's free here, no money, no seat." A flush of shame crept up the older man's neck. He lowered his gaze, avoiding the stares. "I'm not asking for free coffee," he murmured. "Just a dry place to sit for a while." At a nearby table, a group of well-dressed patrons had been watching. One man scoffed, his voice cutting through the room. "Ridiculous. Walks in like some coffee connoisseur with not a dime to his name. Who does he think he is?" A woman beside him added with a sneer. "Even beggars have taste these days." The old man turned to leave, shoulders heavy with humiliation, when a young waitress stepped forward from a corner of the cafe. Her name was Sophie Hart, 29 years old, her auburn hair hastily tied in a loose ponytail. Her usually gentle brown eyes now burned with quiet fury. Carrying a tray of dirty dishes, she strode toward the counter with purpose. Without a word, she set the tray down, reached into her apron pocket, and placed a crisp $5 bill on the counter. "That should cover it," she said, her voice firm and clear, slicing through the tension like a bell ringing at dawn. Leo blinked in disbelief. "Sophie, what are you doing?" he said with a smirk. "You don't have to pay for him. People like that don't just get to come in here for free." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes swept across the room, taking in the faces watching her like an audience waiting for a performance. "I'm paying for his coffee," she said at last, not out of pity, but because I know what it feels like to be judged when you have nothing in your pocket. A mocking laugh rang out from the corner. How touching. The waitress playing hero. Maybe she's hoping for a generous tip later. Sophie turned to face the room, standing tall, voice unwavering. "Kindness isn't a transaction," she declared. "It doesn't make us small, but mocking someone when they're down, that reveals how small you truly are." Silence fell over the cafe. The laughter faded, replaced by quiet unease. Sophie looked back at the man, her tone softening. "You can stay," she said gently. "He'll bring your coffee to you. Don't let cruel words make you forget your worth." The man stood still for a moment, stunned. His eyes glistened. He gave a grateful nod and made his way to a seat by the window, where rain slid quietly down the glass. And for the first time in years, he felt truly seen. Rain still trailed down the caf windows in long, winding streaks. As Sophie prepared the cup of coffee for the stranger, something shifted in the air at Riverside Brew. The gazes that had once brimmed with amusement now quietly looked away. The mocking laughter had faded, replaced by a hush of private reflection. In that moment, amid cold stares and murmurs, Sophie Hart, with her modest income and plain uniform, stood as a quiet emblem of compassion and dignity, and the man she had stood up for. Once deemed unworthy, now found peace in the simplest of things being recognized as human. That image stayed with her long after her shift ended. As she wiped down the last table, Sophie could still feel the residue of whispers, glances, and silences drifting like smoke around her. No one said anything aloud, but it was all louder than words. The next morning, Sophie was called into the manager's office, Mr. Clayton, a perpetually scowling man in his 50s. The tiny room reeked of bleach and burnt coffee. "Shut the door," he said flatly. Sophie obeyed. Clayton folded his arms, his eyes sharp and accusing. "This is a business. Sophie, not your personal charity." She didn't argue. "You don't get to decide who gets free coffee. If you want to play guardian angel, do it off the clock." "I paid for the coffee," she replied calmly. "That's not the point," he snapped. "You embarrassed your coworker, made customers uncomfortable." Sophie looked him square in the eye. "He embarrassed himself?" Clayton's jaw tightened. "Don't test me. Your job is to serve, not to sermonize." A beat passed. "Can I go now?" she asked. "Get out, and remember your place," he barked. Back in the kitchen, Lana and Brent stood by the sink. They fell silent as Sophie entered. As she passed, Lana muttered under her breath, "Must feel so noble, even if you're still splitting rent with your little sister." Brent snickered. Maybe she thought the old guy was some disguised millionaire. Sophie said nothing. She quietly removed her apron, slipped on her coat, signed out, and stepped into the drizzle. Not in a hurry. The city smelled of smoke and wet asphalt. The apartment she shared with her sister sat on the third floor of a weathered building on Maple Street. One bedroom, peeling walls, and windows that groaned with every gust of wind. Elise, her younger sister, was curled up on the sofa under a thin blanket, her shoulders trembling slightly. "Home," Sophie whispered, gently pressing her forehead to Elise. "You're late," Elise murmured. Sophie smiled, got caught in the rain. She reheated a pot of porridge, added a pinch of salt, and handed it to her sister. Then she opened her wallet, 3 crumpled dollar bills, an old subway card, and a faded photo of their mother in her youth. She stared at them a moment before folding the wallet closed. No regret. Not for the coffee, not for the stairs, just no regret. When Elise fell asleep, Sophie sat by the window. Her reflection hovered on the glass of pale face, tired eyes, but with a quiet flame flickering deep inside. She thought back to when she was 14. The day her mother fainted at Easton Market, and people walked by, stepping around them like they didn't exist, all except for one old woman in a patchwork skirt. She had knelt beside Sophie, handed her a bottle of water, and wrapped a worn scarf around her shoulders. Sophie never knew the woman's name, but she never forgot her. That moment had become an unspoken promise. So when she saw the soaked, humiliated man in the caf, that same invisibility in his eyes, she didn't think twice. She just acted, not because of who might be watching, but because of who she was. Before turning off the lights, Sophie whispered to herself, better to be criticized for doing right than praised for staying silent. In that worn-out apartment, where dignity was the only wealth they had, Sophie felt something rare, peace. 4 days had passed since then. 4 long shifts shadowed by side-eyes, whispered comments, and the kind of silence that presses down harder than any insult. Sophie was used to being overlooked. But this unwanted spotlight made every step in the caf feel heavier. That morning, the caf bustled as usual, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of cutlery, the hum of conversations. Sophie moved from table to table, wiping crumbs, clearing cups, offering her practiced, polite smile. Then the doorbell chimed. She didn't look up right away, but something in the air stilled. A quiet shift she couldn't ignore. Her eyes lifted, drawn to the entrance. A tall man stepped in, salt and pepper hair neatly combed, a silk scarf at his collar, a charcoal gray suit pressed to perfection. Shining leather shoes tapped gently across the wooden floor. He didn't head for the counter, didn't scan for an empty seat. He walked straight to the window table, the very one the rain-soaked man had sat at days ago, and took a seat without a word. Sophie froze, cloth in hand, heart thudding in her chest. She recognized that figure. She approached, menu in hand, more from habit than need. Before she could speak, he looked up. He walked across the wooden floor, each step echoing softly in the quiet caf. He didn't belong here, not in this rustic little coffee shop tucked in the heart of the city. He looked like someone who had just stepped down from the top floor of a glass tower in the financial district. But there was something in his eyes, something Sophie Hart couldn't mistake. She froze, still clutching the cloth in her hand. He didn't go to the counter, didn't glance around. He walked straight to the window seat, the very one where the rain-soaked man had once sat. Without a word, he took a seat. Sophie's heart pounded. She approached, holding the menu like a shield, unsure whether to pretend or to speak the truth. Before she could say anything, he looked up. "I'm not here to order," he said, his voice deep and calm. She stood still. A pause lingered between them. "I just have one question," he continued. "Why did you help me?" Sophie blinked. I couldn't just stand there," she said softly. "I didn't know you. I wasn't gaining anything. But you didn't look like a man asking for a handout. You looked like someone being made to feel worthless. And I know that feeling." She pulled out a chair and sat across from him, placing the menu aside. "When I was 17, she began. My mother collapsed in the middle of Brunswick Market. No one stopped. They walked around her like she was garbage. Only one old woman paused. She had nothing, but she knelt beside us, gave me water, and draped her scarf around my shoulders. That day, I promised if I ever got the chance, I'd do the same." He didn't interrupt. He just listened. "That day," she whispered. I remembered that promise. Silence fell again. Then he asked, "Do you read much?" Sophie tilted her head. "Books?" He nodded. "Yes, I used to read a lot. Not so much these days. But I've always liked stories where ordinary people do extraordinary things." A faint smile crossed his face, and just like that, They started talking about books, the city, music, about Bach and Chopin, and why people become cruel when they feel powerless. He mentioned authors she had never read, but she didn't pretend. She asked questions with genuine curiosity. Time slipped by. The noise of the caf faded. At some point, Sophie laughed, her first real laugh in days. "You're not what I expected," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" She shrugged. "I thought you'd just say thank you and disappear." He looked down, then slowly back up. "I've had money for a long time, but very few people have ever made me feel like a regular person again. That day, you did." Sophie didn't reply. She didn't need to. In that moment, they were no longer Waitress and Billionaire, no longer the helped and the helper, just two human beings truly seeing one another. A week later, Sophie received an envelope, no return address, no note, just a thick ivory card with gold trim bearing the familiar emblem of the Ellington Royale Hotel, five-star hotel in the heart of Belmont City. Known only to dignitaries and high-end investors, her name was printed in elegant script across the top: Sophie L. Hart, guest of Julian C. Avery. She held the card for a long time, the late afternoon sun catching the gold border, making it shimmer like a secret about to be revealed. She had almost decided not to go, but curiosity mixed with something harder to name led her to the hotel's grand lobby 3 days later. She wore her nicest blouse, borrowed shoes from her roommate, and her hair was clipped back with trembling hands. As she stepped through the revolving doors, the world seemed to shift. Marble floors gleamed, crystal chandeliers sparkled, and people moved with the quiet certainty of those who belonged. At the reception desk, she spoke in a nervous voice. "Sophie Hart, I believe I have an appointment." The receptionist smiled politely, as if her name came as no surprise, and directed her to a private lounge on the 21st floor. "Mr. Avery will be with you shortly," the clerk said. The elevator rose in silence. Her heart beat with a clarity that made her chest ache. The waiting room was serene, dark leather chairs, soft jazz playing, and a panoramic view of the city like a kingdom far below. She stood by the window, unsure whether she belonged in this place at all. Then the door behind her opened. She turned. Julian, but not the rain-soaked man from the caf. Not even the sharply dressed gentleman from the other day. This time, he entered like someone who didn't need to prove who he was. Two assistants paused at the threshold before departing. He walked forwards, steady, composed. He didn't need to command the room. He was the room. "Sophie," he said, voice warm and low. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming," he said, his voice low and gentle. Sophie tried to smile, but her throat tightened. "This place doesn't feel much like a coffee shop." He gestured to a table by the window, already set with hot tea, fresh fruit, and an untouched cup of espresso. "Please, have a seat," he said. She sat, uncertain whether she was being honored or evaluated. He joined her, fingers interlaced on the table. "I wanted to speak to you in person," he began, "because anything else would feel dishonest." She waited in silence. "My name is Julian C. Avery," he continued. "I'm the founder of Avery Group International. We operate in 12 countries, mainly in infrastructure and socially driven investments." Sophie blinked. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. "I wasn't pretending to be someone else," he added quickly. "But that morning at the caf, I dressed plainly. I deliberately left my wallet behind. I wanted to know what people would see when there was nothing to take. Sophie stared into her tea as if searching for answers in the steam. "My wife passed away 15 years ago," he said, voice softening. "Cancer. Sudden. We had no children. After she died, I lost my faith in people. I stopped believing in kindness." He looked up at her. "So I began traveling, without my name, without a title, not for leisure, but to see if the human heart still existed out there somewhere." His eyes were deep and searching. "And that day, I found someone." Sophie's throat tightened. She wasn't sure if the feeling inside was gratitude or something far more unsettling. "So, this was all orchestrated," she asked, voice trembling, a test to see how it'd react. "No." He shook his head. "I didn't approach you. I didn't ask for anything. I simply observed. And you chose, all on your own." She shook her head slowly. "I don't know if I should feel moved or manipulated." He nodded. "I understand that." Suddenly, Sophie stood, the chair scraped softly against the carpet. "So what now?" she asked. "You're telling me I passed some moral exam? You going to write me a check, offer me a job, a car?" He didn't flinch. "I haven't brought anything, unless you're willing to hear me out." Her breath caught. Inside her was a storm shock, anger, curiosity, and an inexplicable sense of awe. He rose too, walking to the window with his hands behind his back. "I wasn't testing you, Sophie," he said gently. "I was searching for something I thought the world had lost, and maybe someone to remind me that I'm still human too." She looked at him, saying nothing. "I don't want your gratitude," he said. "I only want to know, would you be willing to share another cup of coffee with me? No expectations, no walls." Sophie didn't see the designer suit, the luxurious room, or the status he represented. She saw the same eyes that once lowered in shame, the wet hair, the worn coat. She took a deep breath. "I don't know what this is," she said softly, "or what you hope it becomes. But I know who I am." Julian turned to her, something unspoken flickering in his gaze. "And who are you?" he asked quietly. She smiled, not big, not proud, just honest. "I'm someone who doesn't do things to be noticed, and someone who's not afraid to walk away if that's what feels right." He nodded. A faint smile touched his lips. "That's exactly what makes you different." And, for the first time, Sophie understood this was never a test. It was an invitation, not into wealth or privilege, but into something far rarer to be seen and remembered, not for impressing someone, but for being herself when no one was looking. She didn't expect to see him again. She believed that their strange conversation at the Ellington Royale was the final page in a chapter that didn't belong to her life. A window she had glanced through, never meant to step into, but the very next afternoon, another envelope arrived in her mailbox. No gold trim, no sender address, just her name, Sophie Hart, written in careful, elegant script. Inside was a short note, handwritten in steady lines. "Sophie, you'll be in Vermont next week. It's quiet there, peaceful. I would love for you to join me, not for business, not for appearances, simply for the company. No expectations, just a sincere invitation." Julian, tucked beside it, was a round-trip train ticket or two. The train ticket was tucked neatly inside the letter. Sophie held it tightly, as if cradling a breath that hadn't yet been released. That night, in the cramped kitchen of their worn-down apartment on Creswell Street. Sophie stared at the bubbling rice pot while her sister, Elise, lay curled up on their threadbare couch, sipping hot tea and stifling a cough. "You're awfully quiet," Elise noted. Sophie gave a faint smile. "A rare event, huh?" Elise tilted her head, eyes sharp beyond her years. "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" Sophie nodded. She told her everything about the invitation, the ticket, and that strange sensation that a door had just opened and she'd never dared to knock on. "I don't know if I belong in his world," she whispered. "What if I feel completely out of place? What if I embarrass myself or worse, change how he sees me?" Elise thought for a moment. Then she said something Sophie would never forget. "All your life, you've been making space for other people. Maybe it's time someone made space for you for once." That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. She lay still, listening to the soft patter of rain on the window pane, the low rumble of buses below, and the steady tick of the old wall clock. She thought about Riverside Brew, where cruel laughter and cold stares had once surrounded her. She thought about Julian's eyes humble, sincere, vulnerable, and she thought of her mother, who once said, "Don't wait for life to find you. Sometimes you have to step out and find it yourself." By dawn, the decision had been made. Sophie packed lightly a small bag, her old journal, 2 changes of clothes, and the book she'd never finished reading because she'd always been too tired. She left a note for Elise on the fridge, with some money for groceries, and gave her a hug that lingered longer than usual at Union Central Station. Sophie stood on the platform. Her heart caught somewhere between hesitation and hope as the train pulled in with a soft screech and the doors slid open. She stepped inside, not into a life of luxury, but into the unknown. Julian was already waiting in the cabin. No security, no ceremony, just him sitting by the window, a book open in front of him and 2 steaming cups of coffee on the table. When he saw her, he looked up and smiled, not the polished smile of someone used to being served, but something gentler, something real. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. Sophie sat down across from him, setting her bag at her feet. "I didn't think I would either," she replied. "But then I remembered the world doesn't change unless we step into it." He finished for her, nodding. "I'm not promising anything," he continued. "There's no golden path here. I just thought maybe it's time I stopped walking alone." Sophie turned to the window. The city was already fading behind the glass, replaced by trees and open skies. The steady rhythm of the train matched her own heartbeat. She looked back at him. "Maybe," she whispered, "we all need someone to remind us that we still have the right to choose a different road." And so the train rolled forward, carrying 2 strangers connected not by fate, but by something far more intentional, a choice. Sophie didn't know where the journey would lead her, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the answer, because she wasn't running from reality, nor chasing a dream of wealth. She was stepping into something real, and that was enough. The days that followed were unlike anything Sophie had known. No 5-star hotels, no yachts, no glittering brunches. Instead, she woke up in quiet villages and dusty towns, in modest inns and humble community shelters. They traveled in Julian's old Jeep, windows down, hair tousled by wind, faces kissed by the sun and freedom. Julian didn't live like the billionaire the world assumed him to be. They visited orphanages on the outskirts of forgotten towns where children ran up to hug him. shouting his name not because he brought them toys, but because he remembered their birthdays, their favorite books, the jokes only they understood. They went to recovery homes where he never preached, only listened. They sat on the porches of the poor, in homes he'd quietly helped, bill not under his name, but through quiet action. They shared bowls of hot soup made by people who had no idea the man across from them owned a significant piece of Belmont. He might own half the skyline of the city, but to Sophie, he never felt like someone above her. He walked the ground beside her, quietly, with no need for spotlight or praise. She watched it all in silent admiration. Julian never introduced himself, never sought applause. Once, while they were sorting supply boxes in a community food warehouse in Vermont, she asked softly, "Why don't you ever tell them who you are?" He shrugged. "Because once they know, they stop treating me like a person. Everywhere they went." She saw it. His eyes were always searching not for gratitude, but for connection. And once or twice, she caught her own reflection in a shop window and saw herself smiling. A rare, unguarded smile, long forgotten by time. One evening, in a small timber cabin nestled beside a pine forest on the outskirts of Mariel. They sat on the porch, listening to crickets hum in the stillness. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. Their only light came from a kerosene lamp on the wooden table between them. Julian brewed chamomile tea. Sophie wrapped herself in a wool blanket, steam rising from her cup, fogging the glass of the window behind her. They didn't speak for a while, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind that feels shared. At last, Julian leaned back in his chair, eyes gazing into the dark. "I've been offered many things," he said quietly. "Comfort, fame, even love." He paused, then turned to her, voice softer. "But what I really needed wasn't someone to love me. It was someone who understood why I love what I love. Someone who didn't need to be impressed, just present." Sophie didn't answer right away. She let his words hang in the night air. Then, as the lamplight caught in her eyes, something deeper flickered there. "I don't know if I'm that person," she admitted. "I don't know if I understand all the reasons you are who you are. But I do know one thing: I've never felt more like myself than when I'm with you." Julian didn't smile. He didn't look pleased. There was just a calm settling over his face, as if he'd heard an answer he didn't know he'd been waiting for. They didn't hold hands, didn't lean in close. What they shared wasn't physical proximity, it was recognition. Two people, worlds apart in background and age, who had found a quiet harmony in the echoes of their own scars. That night, Sophie sat by the wooden window and scribbled in her journal. Just a few rough words, barely legible piece. Seen, not lost anymore. She closed the journal, tucked it under her pillow, and whispered into the silence, "I wasn't looking for love. But maybe I've walked into something braver than that." Outside, the sky shimmered with stars, silent witnesses to a story still unfolding. Not a fairy tale, not destiny, but two souls, once certain they were alone, now finding each other. 3 months passed. 3 months of quiet mornings and unhurried conversations, of listening more than speaking, of seeing the world not from penthouses and glass towers, but from street corners and crowded community halls. Sophie had changed not in the way people usually hope. She wasn't richer. She didn't dress grandly. Her shoes were still worn at the heel, her journal still filled with messy scrawl and folded corners. But something in her had changed. She walked taller, spoke slower, no longer needed to prove her worth to anyone. Julian saw it too. One afternoon, after a visit to a women's shelter in Fairburn, he told her he wanted to speak privately. They sat on the rooftop of an old church being converted into temporary housing. Behind them, the city lights glowed like a quiet sea. Julian placed a folder in front of her. No ribbon, no ceremony. Inside were legal documents to establish a foundation in her name, the Sophie Hart Initiative. She opened it slowly. "I want to leave something behind," he said, "but not with my name. I've done that enough." His eyes held depth. "I want the next girl, the one waiting tables, caring for her sister, thinking no one sees her to know someone did see her." Sophie didn't say anything. "Not yet." Julian went on. "You don't need to run it. You don't even need to be involved. But it exists because you existed, because someone once chose to see another not for what they had, but for who they were." Sophie gently placed the folder on the table, her fingers still resting on the edge as if not quite ready to let go. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Julian smiled. "You don't have to say anything." But she spoke anyway. She took a deep breath, and when she did, her voice was clear and steady. "Being trusted like this, it's an honor greater than I can put into words," she said, her eyes fixed on his. "But if you'll allow me, I want to try a different path." He nodded, encouraging her. "I want to build something of my own," she continued. "Not with my name on it, not with yours. I want to start from nothing. Not because I don't value what you've offered, but because someone once believed in me enough for me to learn how to believe in myself." Her voice didn't waver. "And I want to offer that to someone else. Not through money, but through presence, through listening, through showing up when no one else does." Julian was silent for a moment. Then he smiled, not in surprise, but with the quiet pride of someone who had always known this day would come. "You've already done that," he said. Sophie looked at him, the man who once stood trembling in a coffee shop, mocked and dismissed, now a guide, a mirror, and more than anything a friend. There was no label for what they were. Not lovers, not quite partners, not family, but something steadier, a soul connection, where truth could be shared without needing a name. He reached out, gently placing his hand over hers on the table. "Whatever you choose to do," he said softly, "he'll always be beside you." Sophie nodded, eyes misted, and in that moment, nothing more needed to be said. Their story had never been about grand promises. It was built on quiet choices, unwavering trust, and the courage to let go not from loss, but from faith. They sat there until the sun dipped completely behind the rooftops, golden light stretching across every window pane. The city, in that moment, was no longer just a place, it was a promise. That when kindness is given without condition, it always finds its way back. And sometimes, the truest form of love is letting someone walk their own path, knowing they carry a piece of you with every step. The rain began again, gentle, steady as the final words appeared across the window of a new calf. The first cup. Sophie stood across the street, umbrella in hand, watching through the misted glass. Her dream had taken form. This wasn't just a coffee shop. It was the coffee shop, the place where it all began, where a man, soaked in rain and shamed for having no wallet, met a waitress who had nothing to offer but a $5 bill, unknowingly changed the course of both their lives. Now, the space belonged to her, but more than that, it belonged to everyone. She had rebuilt it from the ground up, repainted walls, new wooden floors, restored lighting, all through volunteers, small donations, and the quiet support of a man who never once asked for his name to be mentioned. Etched beneath the logo on the front glass was a hand-carved motto: "No one has to earn kindness." Inside, the café glowed with warmth. Soft lighting, gentle jazz playing, bookshelves packed full, and the hum of quiet conversations. The chalkboard behind the counter didn't list prices. Instead, it read, "The first cup is on us. The second, if you can, is for someone else." The piano in the corner waited for the evening band. The tables weren't numbered. Each bore a handwritten word: hope, trust, begin. Sophie stood by the window, watching people pass: a tired nurse, a delivery driver, a mother with 2 children, people who needed a resting place, a space to be reminded they still mattered. Then the door opened. An elderly man entered, his back hunched, coat soaked from the rain. His hand trembled as he pushed the door. His eyes were anxious, almost apologetic just for being there. A young barista stepped forward, unsure. "Sir, this place only serves paying customers." If you don't have Sophie crossed the room and gently placed her hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's all right," she said, then turned to the man. "Would you like a seat by the window?" she asked. He nodded, gratitude flooding his eyes. She smiled. "What can I get you today?" "Just something warm," he murmured. "And a place to sit for a bit. This morning it's been a long one." Her voice softened. "Then let's make the rest of it a little gentler." She glanced at the barista. "This place," she said quietly, "the first cup is always on us. No conditions, no explanations. You don't have to be ashamed," Sophie said gently. The man nodded, eyes wide, accepting a lesson that didn't need to be taught out loud. As she turned to go back inside, something pulled at her. She looked toward the glass and saw him. Julian stood across the street under a black umbrella, coat collar turned up against the wind. His face was calm, his eyes warm. He didn't wave. He didn't come in. He simply stood, watching. Their eyes met. In that quiet moment, something passed between them: gratitude, a goodbye, and more than that, a promise that didn't need to be spoken. He gave a slight nod, then turned and disappeared into the rain. That evening, during the soft opening of the first cup, Sophie stood beside the piano, a microphone in one hand and a warm coffee in the other. The café was full. The air seemed to hum part golden lamplight, part quiet gratitude. "A few years ago," she began, "I paid for a stranger's cup of coffee. I didn't know who he was. I just saw someone being made to feel small, and I couldn't look away." She paused, scanning the room. "That coffee only cost me $5, but in return, it gave me a new way of seeing the world." Some nodded. Others quietly wiped their eyes. "I thought I was helping someone who had lost his way," she continued. "But it turned out, he helped me find a version of myself I didn't know I was allowed to become." She placed the cup gently on the small table next to the piano. "This café isn't about selling coffee. It's about being present." She looked around the room, her voice softening, nearly a whisper. "Someone once told me, kindness doesn't need to be remembered. It just needs to continue." She smiled, "And that's what we're doing here, one cup at a time." Then, almost as if the thought had just drifted in, she added, "There are kinds of love that don't need romance. and some lives are changed by a single act of kindness and the courage to mean it. The room broke into applause, not loud, but like someone had just found something they thought they'd lost. A saxophone began to play from the corner smooth and low, wrapping the room in warmth. Somewhere in the back, a first cup of coffee was being poured for someone who didn't yet know they needed it. And just like that, it began again. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey, a story born from a simple act of kindness and slowly woven into something far greater than either of them could have imagined. Sophie never needed a miracle. She wasn't chasing wealth or status. She simply chose to care on a rainy morning when no one else did. And sometimes that's all it takes to change not just one life, but two. Some stories begin with the smallest things: a glance, a word, or simply a cup of coffee on a rainy morning. The first cup isn't just the story of a girl and a stranger. It's a reminder that kindness doesn't have to be perfect, just honest. That sometimes the most beautiful things don't come from what we get, but from what we choose to give when no one asks and no one is watching. If this story made you smile, brought a tear to your eye, or simply softened something inside you, please leave a like. Share it with someone who might need a little light, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next emotional journey. Because here, every story is a heartbeat, and who knows, you might be the next one we reach. See you in the next video where another soul is waiting to be seen.